Hey everybody, this is Scott. Thought I would do another hopefully quick Ember tutorial today, and I wanted to touch on a subject that can be kind of vague, especially when you first start out with Ember, because there's not a ton of documentation on it, and that's specifically the Ember Run Loop. And it's probably something you've heard people talk about. If you're just starting out with Ember, you've probably heard people say you don't really need to know much about the run loop. And for the most part, that's kind of true. You can definitely build a really good application without ever manually touching the run loop, but I think it is good to know how it behaves and kind of what methods it makes available to you to kind of make your life easier. So hopefully we can go over some practical examples there. So just to go over what version of Ember I'm on, I am on 2.6.2, so normal caveats. If you're watching this in the future and 3 years later's out, some of this stuff might have changed. So much like a lot of my other videos, I'm using the Super Rentals tutorial. If you're not familiar with that, it's a tutorial app that you build if you go to guides.ember.js.com. So just a good place to kind of jump off, and you can fork this repo through the Ember.js GitHub account. So let's kind of start just by creating a new route here. So we'll Ember generate a route, and we'll call it run loop. I'll just run loop. So in a nutshell, what does the Ember Run Loop do? It's kind of similar to the JavaScript event loop. Essentially what it does is it looks at all the code that you're trying to execute in a block, and it tries to place it all those things into a queue and sort it by priority, and then kind of execute that accordingly. So let's hop into our code here. And here is my model file. Let me increase the font size here. So the Ember Run Loop, like I said, it creates different queues, and there are actually 6 queues that you can hook into. So the first is the sync queue, and this is like data binding, updating properties. Think if you bind a property to an input, right, and the user inputs something, we need to fire and update all of our computer properties. That's what the sync queue is, data binding essentially. The next is the actions queue, and this is what's called the general work queue. It usually contains scheduled tasks like promises, so promise resolution, scheduled tasks. Next is the router transitions queue. That's kind of self-explanatory, rerouting the user. Oops. Then it's the render queue, so rendering what's on the page. Oops, I hate that Adam does that. We'll forget the apostrophe. Next is the after render, stuff that happens after rendering. So this would usually be where if you were using some sort of third-party DOM manipulation stuff, if you're using like jQuery UI, or you need to hook in to stuff on the DOM, this is when that stuff would happen, because it needs the DOM to have been rendered in order to manipulate it. And then finally, it's the destroy queue, which is tear down. So we're destroying objects, we're transitioning out, we're destroying components that were on the page, etc. So it looks at a whole block of text, and it organizes it into these different types of queues. So you might write your code, and you might actually have your router transition be the last thing in your block of code, but it'll actually get fired before all the stuff here. And that kind of makes sense, right? Why would I have my Ember app re-render a component on a page if I'm ultimately just going to transition away, right? And if you were to step through the code one by one, you'd see that the transition's supposed to happen last, but the Ember the Ember Run Loop prioritizes all this stuff for you, so it essentially doesn't fire superfluous code. That's really the benefit here. So let's just comment this out and then kind of come back to this. So the first thing that I want to do here, this app uses Ember-CLI Mirage to kind of mock its backend, and I want to pull in some models, in this case the rentals model. So if we actually just go up to the app, you can see here it just has some rentals, has some description, pictures. So for our route, which is run-loop, we want to do something similar. We're going to show those same exact things on the page. So we do that in our model hook. And if you're not familiar with this, I did a nice tutorial on Ember data, so how we can kind of query for data on our backend. Otherwise, you just follow along, return this.store.findAll rental. And that'll be our model hook. So the next thing I want to do is I'm just going to create a component where we'll actually render this, and I'll kind of go over why I'm doing it this way. But let's Ember generate a component called, I'll call it the render component because that's kind of what I want to test here. Cool. So it generated that for me. So let's hop back into our code, and now we have a component up here, a component.js file, as well as a template file. So for right now, let's just keep it really simple. Maybe just add like an h3 tag here. This is the thing we will render. We'll just add some text. Just as placeholder. Oops. Cool. Really, really simple. And then here, let's actually render this. Maybe then h1. This is our route header, just so we know where we are. And then we can just list out our render component. So we come back here. This is our route header, and here is us rendering our little component there. So one of the things I covered in another video is the component lifecycle. And components have different hooks that we can hook into if we want to execute code at a certain point. And one of those is the did_render hook. So I'm just going to add a log here that says we rendered. So if we come here, we look at our console, cool, we can see this in our console, we rendered, because we rendered the component. So what happens if I hide the component, show the component, hide the component, show the component, right? The did_render should essentially fire multiple times. So to test this, let's actually manually do that ourselves. So I'm going to do this by first creating a controller called Run Loop. So this will be the controller for our route. And if we hop back into our code, we have our little Run Loop controller here, and we're going to have a property called should show component, and by default I want it to be true. Yes, we should show the component, but we're also going to have an action, and this can be, actually I don't want to say toggle, we'll just call it click action for right now, because I'm going to manually set this property to true or false rather than just toggling it. So what I want to use is we'll do Ember.set this should show component to false. So let's make this action accessible in our template. And we'll just do button within action. Oops. Cool. So then we also want to wrap this in an if statement, right? Because we want to potentially hide it. If should show component. Then we render this. Maybe we'll add an else and like a description here. And we'll close off this if. Cool. So let's hop back to our app. Cool, now we're not showing it. So we only rendered the component once. So let's actually make this what I originally said I wasn't going to do. This dot toggle property should show component. So if we look here, we can actually see that the render thing actually fires multiple times, right? Because these are in succinct, or excuse me, in separate run loops. I executed the code, it rendered the component. I executed the code, it rendered the template, etc. So what happens if we do something really dumb like this? Right? So this should essentially be like clicking the button multiple times, right? I set it to false, I set it to true, I set it to false, I set it to true, I set it to false, I set it to true. So it should go through and render the component multiple times for us. Let's test that. But you'll see we still only hit the did render loop once. So even though this component should have been shown on and off a bunch of different times, what the Ember Run Loop did for us was it organized all these things so that it could fire all this synchronous behavior at once, updating properties, and then after that it evaluated, okay, now what do I need to render, right? It didn't go through it one step at a time, render all the things it should have. It did that kind of heavy lifting for us. It optimized it for us. So that's actually really cool. So you know me, I like to destructure stuff to make this a little bit easier to read. We have our set, and now I want to bring in run. We're going to manually set our own run loops here. So if you're not familiar with destructuring in ES6, you know, const run equals Ember is the same as, you know, var run equals Ember.run, just kind of a faster way to write it. And I like doing that just because I don't have to write Ember dot so many times. So now we can actually simplify this to that. Makes it a little bit easier to read. And now I want to put all of these things individually into their own run loop. So Ember Run has a ton of different functions that we can utilize. The most obvious one is just the run loop. So what do I want to execute in this code? So this is me, I'm manually creating my own run loop. My run loop is everything that should be executed here. So we can do something similar. So let's, for all of these, let's just do a bunch of them. Oof, that looks ugly. And this one will be true, and this one will be true, and this one will be true. Cool. So now I'm manually forcing my own Ember run loops. So Ember creates the run loops for us automatically when it looks at code and figures out how to execute it. If for whatever reason you didn't want it to do that, you say, hey, I know a lot more about my code than you do. I'm going to manually create my own run loop, you know, prioritize this stuff, and then maybe you can write another run loop, all right, then prioritize this stuff. I actually do want these things to be executed in a certain order. So if we go through and we click this, now you can see our render loop. So right, if we go back to our component, remember we hooked into the did render. So Ember actually went through and rendered and unrendered and rendered and unrendered this component a bunch of times for us, right? Because now we manually we're generating our own run loops. So again, that's kind of what you might have expected the code to do if you had written it that way, to go through line by line, the run loop prioritize and queue it all up for us. But when we kind of force it to kind of do what we want, we can actually make it run really inefficiently. So just one of those really interesting things. And there's lots of different ways we could actually write this. So I mentioned that, you know, the run loop has lots of different methods that you can do. You can actually do run.begin and then run.end. So if rather than wrapping things in a code, we can say open our run loop and then end our run loop. I don't know, kind of an easier way to write that. Maybe if you have a ton of code, it doesn't make sense to wrap everything. You can also, within a block of code, so let's step back through here. Let's get back to this point. So we go through, we do all this stuff, and then maybe I want just one part of my code to be executed separately. That's what the run.next function is. We actually tell it run this one block in the next run loop that's available to us. So don't execute it with all this stuff. This one part should be within its own run loop. Reasons you might want to do this, you might have some weird asynchronous behavior. There aren't a ton of use cases. I've run into a couple of times where I needed a child controller to update a parent, and I was having these weird race conditions, and run.next solved that for me. I forced it to wait for all the other code to be executed before executing that one line for me. It's kind of a handy way to do it. And one of the other things that Ember has is the schedule. So schedule, you can actually hook into particular queues within the Ember Run Loop. So we have run.schedule, and then we can specify which queue we want to schedule it after. So for instance, after render, that would be the first argument to run.schedule. The second, is the context, which is typically the object you're in, and then the next one is a function. So in this case, we're saying, Ember run.next tells it to execute that code in the next run loop. We're still in the current run loop, but I'm specifically telling it when to run this code, and it's going to run it after the after render hook. So it's going to wait for it to go through sync, then actions, then router transitions, then render, then after render, then after that, it's going to execute it before the destroy. So if you want to get super explicit, there might be some code, again, that you want to execute after something's rendered. You have some jQuery function you want to hook into the actual DOM. This is where you would do that. I want to execute it in the after render hook, but I still want it to be part of this run loop. And you can do that with all the different queues if you kind of know where you want things to happen. And you can also create your own queues. So you can use the Ember Run add queue function. So Ember Run add queue is it's actually a private function. I don't think you're really supposed to use it, but you can specify the name of the queue, the Scott queue, and when you want it to run after, so maybe after the sync. So I can actually add my own queue that runs after sync but before actions. And then that's part of the Ember Run Loop in my application. I can hook into that too. I've never done this. Kind of cool to know that it's there. It is private, so I don't think you're really supposed to use it, but hey, it's just JavaScript, so you can really do whatever you want. Cool, so that's kind of the basics of what the run loop does automatically for us, right? It queues things up and prioritizes, and if we want to hook into those prioritizations within the queue for when we want to execute stuff, we can certainly do that. It's really easy. Cool. So what are some other use cases of times when the run loop might be really, really handy for us? So let's take a look at our component real quick. So here we just had some text. Let's add an input of type equals text. I think this app has some preset styles for us. No, maybe not. Anyway, I'm trying to think of a somewhat simple example. So in components, if you watch my components video, you'll know that we can hook into certain jQuery events automatically. So in this case, the input would be this actually fires every time the user actually inputs something. So maybe something really, really dumb would be, I have a type text input, a text type input, but I only want the person to actually type in numbers. Because type equals number works really weird in Firefox, and I want to make it so they work the same across all my browsers. So when the user types something, I'm going to overwrite that if it's not a number, right? It's kind of a simple use case. So the input is an event, if I want to grab the particular input that I want to update, we can do that through, I think it's just event.target, so we can destructure it. Target equals event. That should grab the event.target object from the event that's coming to us. And we want to update the value. So we'll do target dot value equals value dot replace, and we'll replace non-numeric characters, with a blank space. So we're going to delete them automatically. And non-numeric, we'll write our own regex, which I'm looking at on my other screen because I never write regexes right the first time. 0 through 9, and sure, we'll allow decimals too. Cool, so let's see if I did that right. Nope. Value is not defined. All right. Oh. Cool, so I'm trying to type letters here, but it's automatically deleting them for me. But if I type a number, it works. Cool. There's a problem with this though, obviously. I'm updating a value really, really often. There, I actually executed that code 61 times within a few seconds. So it's really inefficient to do it that way, right? That didn't make much sense. So let's start by actually extracting this to a private method. Update our value, and it will accept the target, and then we will just move this down. This dot update our value target. Okay, so doing the same exact thing here. But what if it's an instance where maybe I don't want to just automatically override everything? I actually want to delete the characters when the person finishes typing. So if you've worked in JavaScript before, you might think, oh, this is something I can use like a set timeout and a clear timeout, and kind of do that. So if you're ever using a set timeout within an Ember application, I would recommend using the Ember Run Loop. So they have some built-in methods for us that allow us to do essentially that, setting a timeout and clearing a timeout without all that kind of, big headaches that usually come with that. And we can use what's called Ember-Run.debounce. So let's bring that in. So we're going to destructure Ember again, component, and then run. So now I can delete this, make it a little easier to read. So I want to execute this code. But I only want to do it every half a second. So what debounce does for us is it tells it not to execute the code more than once within this given time. So every half second. So if the person types super, super fast, with every input they provide, it's actually going to update this timer for us. So let's test this out real quick. So maybe if we increase this to like a second, it'll actually fire a little more consistently for us. So if we type, there, it waits a second and then clears it out, because again, rather than trying to execute it with every single input from the user, it actually waits a second, right? And then make sure that we're essentially not firing that function a bunch of times, because we want to wait for the person to stop typing. So a lot easier than doing set timeout and then clear timeout, right? So debounce waits 1,000 milliseconds before executing this. If it gets called again, it resets that timer and continues waiting. If you wanted to do the opposite, if you wanted to fire the function immediately, but then wait a set amount of time before firing it again, you could use throttle. So throttle kind of makes a little more sense. I think it's named a little bit better than debounds. But throttle executes this function immediately the first time that you run it, and then waits the 1,000 milliseconds before it would ever run it again. And I believe it actually accepts another parameter too, where you can called immediate, and you can actually set it to false. It's true by default, so then it actually waits until the end and becomes very similar to debounds. I've never used that, but apparently it's in the API if you ever want to use it. Alright, so we have a kind of a simple example here of updating an input using the internal Ember methods. So let's go through one more example using Ember Run Later. So I'm going to clear out that action because I don't want to use it anymore. And let's get rid of this. And now I'm actually going to pass in our model that we returned right here. So I fetched all of the rentals from my API, and now I'm going to pass it to my my component here. And let's get rid of this because we're done kind of playing around with rendering. And then in the actual template, I'm going to use one of the built-in things that they have in this app. So it's just an unordered list, and they have a component called rental listing. So for each rentals as rental, and we'll close our each. Oops. And that's a list item. It shows the rental listings, and the rental is then passed to that component. So this is what you see on the main page actually when you load up this app. So let's try that real quick, make sure we get it. Cool. So let's say we're working on an app that kind of depends on live data. It wants to check the server and update our model if anything has actually changed. So how would you normally do that? I'm sure there's a lot of really clever ways to do it. Maybe Ember isn't even the right solution if you're building a really complex app. But let's say I want it to fetch my data every 5 seconds, right? This is when, once again, we can leverage the Ember Run Loop to kind of execute code in an organized manner for us. So let's first hop into our controller here. So what do we actually want to do here? We want to, once again, kind of do what we're doing here, using the store to find all rentals. So we do this in the controller because, again, the controller kind of controls what's accessible on our template. So by the point in time we've gotten here, model is no longer accessible on our route object. The controller is in charge of it. So after the model hook, what Ember routes call is the setup controller hook, which accepts 2 parameters. And then all it does is Ember.set controller model to be the model hook, at which point the model is then destroyed, no longer part of this. It's passed, essentially, ownership is essentially passed to the controller. So that's actually a hook you can hook into if you ever wanted to rename your model. You can do that right there. But that's kind of what happens in the background automatically for us. But the thing is that routes have access to the store by default. Controllers do not. So if we want to access the store to query and update our model, we'll actually have to inject it. So once again, we'll extend Ember to use the inject method. And we'll say store is inject. It is a service. So the service function actually does accept 1 parameter, which is the name of the service. However, if the name that you're naming it within your object matches it, you actually don't have to specify it here. It'll do that automatically. Cool. So we're going to inject a service. We're destructuring here. If we wanted to continue to destructure and get really fancy, we could. Whoops. We could then destructure service from inject. So now service store just is a service. Kind of easier to read, right? What is store? Well, it's a service I'm accessing. Cool. So I want to write a function called refresh our model, right? Refresh our model. So again, I want to run this maybe every 5 seconds or 10 seconds, maybe 15 minutes, right? At some point, I just want to update the page, and I want to check the back end to see if our data has updated at all. So let's create a variable called our refresh model, and that equals the Ember Run .later. So this is kind of like set timeout. I want to run this code, but later I'm going to tell it to wait 5,000 milliseconds, so 5 seconds. So what do we want to do in here? Well, first we're going to fetch new records. Right, we're going to get that from our back end. Then we want to set the new records to our existing model. New records to existing model. So we're going to update the model on our page, and then we want to tell this to fire this again in 5 seconds. Cool. So we have access to the store. We can use Ember's get method, because again, it's the route objects automatically have access to the store, controllers don't. So I want to get this store object from this, my controller, and just like before, we're still going to call find all rental, right? Now the model hook automatically knows that it's a promise that has to resolve. In this function, we actually don't know that, right? So if I tried to execute this code, it would try to do it synchronously, and it wouldn't actually wait for the promise to be resolved. But because I want to manually set model to be the result of this, we would use the then, which is, do this after this is done running. And then we want to access the result of it as model, and we're going to set this, so the existing model, which is our rental model, to be the new model, which is our local. In fact, why don't we call this rentals? Makes it a little more easier, right? We're going to set our model to be rentals, which is the result of our find all call. Cool. So it's going to go through. Ember Run Loop is still going to try to queue all this stuff up, even though we're doing it in a later loop, right? We're still, all we're doing is just saying wait a little bit to run this. It's still going to try to prioritize all this stuff. And let's move this comment up, because that's what we do there. So finally, we want to fire this again, but I want to schedule when this is going to run. So if I were to update my model, right, I would get an update from my back end that would populate to my model, and then it would render stuff on the page. So maybe I would want to schedule the next call of this to actually happen after it renders. So maybe we can do run.schedule after render, so utilizing when we want the next call to this function to be called, and then we will just call our own function again. Cool. So let's just step through this one more time. So refresh model is a variable I'm creating. It's going to be the result of the run later, which is essentially just a set timeout. Run this code after 5,000 milliseconds. We're going to hit our store. We're going to find all rentals. So we're querying our backend again to essentially look for any update within our model. Then, after the run loop has resolved the first few queues after the render queue, I want to call this function again. And then we let's just go through this real quick. Let's in fact add a console log here. Oops. It says we are refreshing. so we can see when it gets refreshed. But we need to tell it when to fire this function, and we can just do that when we first initialize this controller. So refresh our model, and then you want to be sure that you call this dot super arguments, right? So we don't want to overwrite what it does by default. So what this function does, if you're not familiar with it, and if you're not familiar with it, check your console because you're probably getting errors telling you to use it, is that it says, execute all this code, okay, and then do whatever you would normally do in the init hook. If I didn't have this, we're overwriting the init hook in our controller. And if this controller adopts from a parent controller or something, you might get some unexpected behavior. And there's no overhead to adding this, so it's just kind of a nice hook to have in there. Cool. So if we look at our console log, you can see, look at that, it keeps updating. We are refreshing, and it's going to wait another 5 seconds, and it's going to call we are refreshing again. And it Ember-CLI Mirage is recording that we have successful requests. So cool. Every 5 seconds it's going to go through and it's going to query our backend. It's going to update our model for us. So if you wanted to create a page that kind of did that, you probably want a longer timeout than 5 seconds. That's really fast. But this is how you could do that. Now what happens if we want this to stop, right? How can we do that? Well, luckily the Ember Run Loop has a function called cancel, so we can actually cancel things within our run loop to keep it from executing. So let's take a look at that. So in order to access that, we have to make this run.later call accessible elsewhere. So that's actually why I name it as a variable here. And let's add a refresh model object to our controller by default. By default it'll be null. And then at the end of our run loop here, we can set this refresh model. So this, in this case, is our controller. Find the property of refresh model, which is this, and we will set it to be the same as our local variable refresh model. Cool, so now that is accessible on our controller object. So let's actually make it so that we can actually manually cancel that. So we will add an action called cancel auto refresh, and we'll use run.cancel. Let's separate this out. Let refresh model equals get this. So now we're gonna have to get it, right, because it's not, we don't have access to it directly within this function, and then we're gonna cancel refresh model. Easy peasy. So now let's actually call this function from our template. So if we go back here, let's add another button, because I love buttons so much. Action, cancel refresh, cancel refresh. So it's going to go through, it's going to refresh the page for us. We'll wait 5 seconds. We are refreshing. If we wait another 5 seconds, it should say we are refreshing again. Cool, but if I cancel this and I come back here and I wait 5 seconds, nothing happens. Cool, right? Because it canceled it for us. So we can write functions that, check our back end every X amount of time, but maybe there's instances where you don't want that overhead and you don't want it communicating with the back end. That's when you can utilize run.cancel. And run.cancel works for everything, not just those kind of set timeout instances. You can use them for debounces and throttles. You can cancel those. So we say, throttle debounces only run this function once every 10 seconds. But if we get to the end of it, we can actually just cancel that. So don't bother running it when you get to the end of the 10 seconds. We can also maybe add a counter. Maybe we actually have this increment some sort of counter, and when it hits 5, then we actually cancel it. So that way we only look for updates 5 times before kind of giving up. I don't know, however you want to handle that. So much like the inject, we can actually destructure the run loop as well. So we're using later, we're using schedule, and we're using cancel. So then all these run dot calls we can actually get rid of. And I think that looks a lot better, right? Because run dot whatever is kind of vague, but if you look at a function that's called later, you might actually kind of make sense. Schedule kind of makes sense. Cancel makes sense. Cancel off the refresh model. I'm always in favor of things that read well. Cool. So, I mean, that's kind of it for the Ember Run Loop. Again, you might not ever have to really ever use it. I think it's super useful for instances where you would normally use set timeout. So again, if you're ever using set timeout, go and look at your code. You might be able to use something like debounce or throttle or later. Just kind of makes it easier for Ember to digest, and timeouts can always kind of have some weird async behavior with that. If you ever want to manually force something to run after the page renders, use those schedule hooks, because you might actually get unexpected behavior. You might write code and think it's going to be executed in a certain way, but it prioritizes it differently within that queue, so you can kind of force it to do things. In tests, if you've ever written a unit test, an integration test, you'll probably see a function that says you have to wrap async helpers into a run. That's because the Ember Run Loop doesn't fire in tests. So if you actually need to schedule it in an auto run, you have to essentially force it to, because you'll probably use jQuery in tests, like integration tests, to like update inputs and stuff, and that typically has to be wrapped in a run. Otherwise, Ember will wait and fire it at the end of the test, and then your test won't pass. But that'll probably be the only time you'll ever see that you have to use the run loop. There's always ways to get around it, but it's kind of just good to know kind of how that works. So hopefully you found this somewhat useful. And if you have any questions, leave a comment. Hopefully I can address that. And if you ever want to read more about the Ember Run Loop, you can read more on the Ember.js website. It kind of goes over all the different functions, different times you can use it. There's some that we didn't go over, such as the Ember Run.bind. We went over cancel and debounce. And rather than wrapping things in a run loop, we can call begin and end. Join. If run loop is present, it will queue itself to run on the existing run loop's queue. So yeah, read through this stuff. But like I said, most of the time you won't use most of these functions, but it's good to know kind of what's available to you. Well, thanks for watching.